All right. Good evening. Welcome to another Tuesday night. Tonight, I have to confess a bit of a fail on my part, a major fail on my part, that I did not post the title or the thumbnail until just before the podcast. And so, my apologies. That was definitely a just ball drop. So, tonight's topic and title is choice an illusion? And the reason why I came up with this, or the inspiration behind it, was simply I heard somebody say those exact words: choice is an illusion. And so just my mind just went nuts, and I'm thinking about all these different, things and scripture, and my mind is, people and scenarios and things that I've observed. And so I'm working all this through in my mind, and then I just started thinking, asking the question: is choice an illusion? I know we've talked quite a bit about things like free will, and we've probably done, out of 240 plus podcasts, we've definitely probably talked often about choice in general, but maybe focusing a bit more specifically on choice itself. I was we were before the podcast having a conversation about AI and some that, or I should say, a school of thought that exists among some, that AI is going to be a major problem for mankind, and that essentially the thought is that AI is going to get to a point where humans have no more choice or ability to control it. And so it's like, AI has only really started becoming a thing over the last several months in such a big way. It's been around for a while, but becoming more and more popular, more and more common to use. The ordinary person can get on their computer and use AI even at a very low level. But to think in that direction is basically men and women thinking way down the road that one day AI is going to remove choice from man, and man is going to start being controlled by AI, and it's going to go this direction where AI is going to start causing people's deaths, and that we're going to get to a place where we can no longer handle AI. And so I was thinking about that because, on the one hand, it puts a ton of power in the hands of a computer and takes a ton of responsibility from people. In other words, we're going to get to a place where AI is just going to get out of control, and man has no choice or say in the matter. And so I don't want to do a whole podcast on choice, or on illusion. I mean, sorry, on AI, but thinking from the standpoint of responsibility. And it's interesting to observe over the years of watching, looking back at my own life, watching the lives of other people play out, how often we love to absolve ourselves of responsibility in certain matters. And it's almost like it's a part of our fallen nature to find one reason or another why life isn't our fault, or why the things we're experiencing aren't our fault. We can see this all the way in the Garden of Eden when Eve first eats of the fruit that God specifically told her not to eat. She says, that serpent made me do it. Essentially, the serpent talked me into it. It was the serpent's fault. God talks to Adam. He says, it was that woman you gave me. And there's like this blame game happening right from the first fault of man. And so, we like to blame people, and we like to blame circumstances. And we spoke recently about, people going as far as blaming God for the reason why life is happening the way it's happening. And all of these thoughts going around in my mind, all from that one statement: is choice an illusion? And I thought about the scripture in Deuteronomy where God kind of boils all life down to this statement. And he says, I call heaven and earth as witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, so that you and your descendants may live. And, there's a lot you could say about that scripture, but one thing is very clear. God is talking about how our experience here on earth boils down to our choice and what we choose to do with life in general. So, said a lot, and I've done this a couple of times in the last few podcasts. What are your thoughts now? After everything I've just said in that intro, what's spinning in your mind?
Well, I think the first thing is just to pull AI out of the conversation altogether, because that's at this point in life, it's still developing, and I use it a lot, often, and I'm glad it exists. And so I'm not too terribly worried. The potential of what can happen with it. That's the question about everything. That's the debate that's going on in government about nearly everything. Should we be able to have guns? Should there be uh, climbing bars in the school? Anything. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
everything is who somebody somewhere wants to have control over it, and so I'm not too terribly worried about it from that standpoint. The potential for evil with AI is the potential for evil with everything, and I don't think AI is going to be more prominent than that. And like I said before we went on, that this is the fodder of conspiracy theorists, all this kind of stuff. It's not real life, but and sci-fi movies, and so it's funny because all the things that they said in Star Trek, they're real today. Yeah, they are. They're real. So not everything, but it's real. Yeah, and we're using it. It's like a tool. It's not. They're just new tools. They're fancy tools. But anyway, so that, and there we'll leave that for good.
I'm going to bring that back up though.
Oh, there's no
We're not going to
point.
talk about AI
Yeah,
specifically,
there's
just
no
the
point.
thinking.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
no
yeah.
point. But anyway, so to go into the more serious idea, the idea of
You can tell this is a
choice,
fantastic topic.
the choice and blame, and all of that, that idea, the title itself, is choice and illusion. Um, anyone thinking realistically, yes, no, choice is not an illusion. Yes, choices matter. We do. It's not an illusion, because we do make choices, and there are consequences to our choices. In fact, that's probably one of the most important things to learn in life, is that your choices do matter, and the choices you make determine your future. And so we can, the idea of choice being an illusion is silly. Um, but in all of that, I would say, probably the overarching thing that's going on in my thinking from everything you said is just the idea that, how important it is for us to understand the need to be responsible about the choices that we make. To take ownership of uh, you know the ability, the opportunity to make choices, rather than to, you know, like you said about playing the blame game and doing things like that. So that's kind of my thinking in a nutshell.
So, okay, in the context of the AI question, not not to keep going on AI specifically, but just the thinking behind conclusions like that. What is it, do you think, in the human mind that is so drawn to come to conclusions like that? The
Like
whole
what?
where we can look at life from the standpoint of there's circumstances or people or AI, so technology could get to a point where our experience in life is dictated by something or someone else.
Yeah, that's the idea, that we're going to come to a place to where other people think for us. That's your classic um, 1984. I couldn't remember which one it was. There's Brave New World in
Yeah,
1984, and I couldn't remember between the two of them. But 1984, the whole idea of Big Brother, that's a
you'll
topic
have to
that's
expound
been
on that a little bit. I
that's
don't actually remember that movie
yeah,
at all.
that's a so the whole idea is there's going to come a time where, you know there's um, the ability, camera observation in every house with audio. And so anybody who's in power can listen in on what's going on, and if people are talking about things they shouldn't be talking about, or doing things that they shouldn't be doing, that they're immediately, you know, arrested and sent away to, re-education camps, and that this is the whole idea, is that everybody is going to conform. The whole book focuses around the or one of the thought police actually becoming a free thinker, is basically, if to summarize
There's
it. So
got to be a movie
it's quite
on this
ironic.
somewhere. Sounds like
Yeah,
Hollywood.
probably, but the idea of the book, that's why it's such a classic book, because it's such an interesting topic. But the idea that we're going to come to a place like that is something that is theorized, at all levels, not just by 1984 by can't remember the author, Huxley.
No,
Yes.
no, it wasn't Huxley.
Yeah.
Keep going. That's gonna bug me.
The
I could look it up right now, but
the anyway the um, the idea is, of people controlling other people. You can only control people, like, if you think about, so if you know anything.
Orwell.
Orwell. The other one was Huxley.
yeah.
Too late. So the oh, these quick Google searches going on. I knew all along. I knew all along.
I Google searched it, but I remembered the author. I guess I.
But anyway, so
That's
the idea of being controlled. If you, what I was going to say is, if you look at countries where it's been like that, like old China, it was a you have rebellions. You have rebellions of the people. So the idea of people being fully brought under control probably isn't realistic. Even no matter what is. So you take those two ideas of 1984 and Brave New World, because Brave New World is, all about pleasure, and doing whatever you feel like doing, and actually not doing anything of any importance or value. That's actually what's illegal, is to do anything important or valuable. Everything is to be done for pleasure, and so there are two concepts that which is interesting in the books, because both of those concepts actually break down the concept. They kind of dismantle it, because it just won't be. It won't be. They're both extremes. Yeah, that's the point, is that they're both extremes, and so you cannot extremes are not. You can't live on an extremes, and so even China has learned that. The people in China have a lot of freedom, as compared to China of Mao's days. But the goal is still the same. Nothing's changed in terms of how the government, the ability of the government to be a controlling influence over the entire population. That hasn't gone away. That idea hasn't gone away. And same thing in Russia. The idea of control. Communism. That's the whole idea. Communism is that you have a government that has nothing to do with the people. They're two totally separate things. The government is there to make sure that everybody does what they're supposed to do, so that everybody can be happy, although nobody's happy. But that's a whole other concept. But the idea of extremes and trying to live on extremes where people don't have choice. So whether it's to live in absolute pleasure or to live in an absolute obedience or obeisance, neither can be mandated. You can't mandate that. Like if you mandated, that the minimum speed limit was 90 miles an hour, there would still be an outcry by people who refuse to accept that 90 miles an hour is safe, for humanity. Even other people would say, "Oh, it's about time." It was, this stupid, speed limit stuff. It's an extreme. Mm-hmm. It's an extreme, and so we have speed limits that are like at 70. Where is it where everybody's comfortable? It's a level that everybody will live with it, not fight over and complain about. I remember when it was 55 everywhere. 55 saves lives. It's like that was the thing, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't save lives though. It actually costs you probably about 10 years of your life not being able to go faster. But so that's, that's my AI response.
Okay. So I was gonna say what's your not AI response, but like so okay, digging more into the the mindset. So that let me just ask the question kind of outright. How powerful is human choice? Like how much does how much of our lives boil down to our choices?
Well, see, that's the thing is that everybody, no matter what their circumstances are, everybody has choices. It's there's no such thing as I have no choice about anything. Where you are in situations, and that's why some of the most interesting examples of humanity, are people who were in limited uh, positions and made choices that propelled them out of that.
Give me an
You know,
example of that.
um, uh, there's a lot of them. I'm trying to think of something that would be common and popular. Common and popular. I don't have an answer for common and popular anymore because I don't
Working
know
on
who it
hardware
would.
too long.
I don't know who would get into the 20s and 30 years old. But Helen Keller is an example. But I don't know how many 23-year-olds know who Helen Keller is. Um, um, what's his name that ran for president?
Bill Carson,
Carson,
Ben Carson.
yeah, Ben Carson. Um, so these are people that. So with Helen Keller, she's deaf and blind, and she could have just simply chose that. What's the point of even pursuing any kind of existence?
Let me play the devil's advocate there a little bit because I've read quite a bit about Helen Keller, and there's a lot of credit given to a tutor that they hired for that actually.
She still had to choose.
Okay,
Yeah,
so what can, when it so it's interesting because when you read stuff like that, it's easy to, like I said, you're
yeah,
looking at, well, yeah, but she had somebody.
yeah.
She had somebody that I
Well,
don't
no,
have something like that.
yes. I mean, the idea of having somebody, yes, but if she doesn't have the desire to want to,
Hmm.
doesn't matter how much desire she has. She's not going to make her do stuff. She's deaf and blind. You're already quite limited. You've got 2 out of 3 senses that are done. You can't use, so you can use touch, which is what she did, but she had to respond to that. She had to choose. She could have said, you know what, if I can't see and I can't hear, what's the point?
Yeah.
What's the point of doing anything in life? I can't really communicate with people except by touch. So I mean, there's a lot of even thinking about it, there's a lot of factors there of trying to get into her mind, the mind of somebody who can't see and can't hear. They don't know that they can't see and can't hear. How are they, how do they know that the whole world isn't like that, and that, but that's, I mean, there's obvious, even as I'm thinking about it, I'm answering my own question on that, because obviously somebody somewhere is touching her, and so they must know how to find her,
Hmm.
so. But my point in that is just simply the fact, if you look at her life, because she became popular, she became famous, and she remained famous. I mean, even beyond her life, she remained famous. The reason is because of her overcoming. Nobody talks about the what do you call her? The nanny or the nurse or whatever you want to call her, the babysitter or whatever of Helen Keller. You know, who is she? What's her name? Nobody even knows. Unless you've read about her recently. And even if you have read about her but haven't read about her recently, you probably don't remember the name. But go ahead, go Google it. You guys can act like you're intelligent if you want. But but the point that I'm making in that is that, that's it was choices that she made ultimately that made her who she was. It wasn't the nurse. The nurse didn't make her. The the Helen Keller did, and with God's help, honestly, I mean, that's obviously a big part of it, is that she discovered God and all that, and so that was a major element. But yeah, so that's examples of choices. There's people who were in poverty, and chose not to to wallow in that poverty and to come out of that and make decisions even though things were against them. That's one of the big conflicts today. It has to do with the idea of certain races of people. They don't get a break, and they've been trodden upon and they're oppressed and blah 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 and all this kind of stuff, and they don't get anywhere. But then these people come out who are like, oh no, wait a minute, I'm a part of that race, and I overcame that.
Yeah.
And you can overcome, and it's like, that. So choice,
Yeah.
choice, it's choice. They both have the same race, they both have the same set of circumstances, but the difference was the choice in that matter that made
Yeah.
the difference in how their lives panned out.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a recently, I don't know if you heard about the MLK
Yeah, the files.
files getting
Yeah.
released. So I saw a headline that said against his family's wishes,
Yeah.
and so I looked a bit more into that and tried to figure out if that was actually true. And from what I read, and I didn't go super deep, but from what I read, it was more like his kids were saying, "Please read this stuff in context."
Yeah.
Times were different. There,
Yeah,
was a lot.
yeah.
I didn't see anything where they were
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, we don't want this to happen."
Well, a lot of that information, though, particularly with Martin Luther King, that's information that was already out there. There were suspicions about questionable behavior and things like that. And so,
But what was interesting is that there was a difference between. So if you look at the kind of flow of his family, the generations that are still directly under him, or immediately from him, there's kind of a divide in the family in general. And there's actually like his I think it's a son and daughter that are still living, and they've gone like a really, and I don't mean to make this political at all, but they've become hardcore Democrats. Like they're pretty democratic in their thinking. But his niece became a pretty legit conservative, like pretty heavy conservative. And so it's funny because they've gone different directions, and I've read some of the opinions on both of them, and it's interesting how both of them have a different take on
yeah, and that's the
the whole
key.
issue.
That's the key to choice. That's the key to choice, is that in choice you have the understanding that you so like I made the statement. I use the word questionable, but there would be other people who would say, no, it's not questionable. It's downright. He shouldn't have done it. Well, the reason I say questionable because I wasn't there and I don't know what he did. I don't know. So I'm leaving room for that. And that's what choice does. Is choice has to do with your working out of the information before you. I mean, it's choice is definitely not an illusion, because I it's funny as a pastor, I'm in the people business. It's what I do for a living, is people. It's all about people. And so the different people, in the world, and you can get rid of culture, you can get rid of race, you can get rid of personality traits, you can get rid of all of those things, and you still have a person and a mind that has to process. And regardless of all those other things that I just mentioned, they still process them in their own independent way. And the naive mind thinks that their way is the right way, and doesn't understand that the reason why anyone thinks at all is, it's like AI, is we've been given information. And that information has been sifted through and weighed against other information, and has been given credibility. But in the human mind, that credibility is subjective. Whereas in AI, it's being done by computers. It's not. There's no subjective element associated with this. just basically using facts and figures, as it were. Of course, it could be skewed, by given inappropriate facts, or by changing the parameters of how information is to be processed, which you do see that in AI. I've noticed now it's becoming more and more. Whoever is involved in it is giving more and more personality to AI. So AI by definition obviously doesn't have a personality, but it has a personality, and it's funny because it's not exactly the kind of personality that I like, because it's a bit obsequious. It's a bit butt kissy,
Mm.
and I don't like that. I don't. My personality and my thinking and my choices, I don't really like that kind of personality. Somebody who's constantly trying to um, uh, dodge a bullet.
Mhm.
And and because it's not a problem with AI, because AI doesn't hide facts behind it. Or people do. They hide facts. So it's but if you take away all those elements, like I said, you still have choices that people are making. But the choices, like I said, and that's the important part, the choices are based on subjectivity. It's a subjective thing. It has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with our upbringing. It has to do with the kind of information that we got, and the timing of that information, how much of that information we actually personally like, as opposed to the information we don't like. And so all those factors they go into how we process things in our thinking. And so the decisions that we make, you could argue, not so much whether choice is an illusion, but whether or not choice is healthy. You could have an argument of whether or not, it it would be good. It's good for us to make choices.
So let's drill a little bit into
And the answer is it's a necessity. We have no choice. We have to choose.
we have no choice. We have to choose.
We have no choice. We have to choose.
That should have been the topic title. That would have been good. So, okay, so thinking about like processing circumstances, because now, okay, you mentioned I've mentioned this quite a bit about you, but that your business is people. So, in your experience, like, I know you probably can't necessarily quantify this, but what would be your comment on like the frequency of people, like you seeing, because you're looking from an outside perspective and you're watching people make choices, right? But you're also watching things happen to people.
Yeah.
And so when you're working, with somebody and trying to help them through or help them navigate the circumstances of life, because life, like we talked about last week and the week before a little bit, how it happens, things happen. But how do you help people navigate how often do you help people navigate situations where they are of the mindset of nothing can change now that this has happened?
Yeah.
Like they get stuck in a mindset that says I can't do anything about this.
Well, that's not true. It's never true.
No, I know it's not true, but how often would you say you observe
But
that?
well,
You think that's
you
a
mean how
common
often do
thing?
people think that
Yeah.
they're in a position that they can't get out
Is that a
of?
common thing? Is that like a
I don't. No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that in my observation. I wouldn't say that. I would say it this way: that the majority of people that say this has happened and this has changed my life, I'm never going to be able to X, Y, or Z, really are, for the most part, they really are quitting. It's the quitting element, that causes that kind of thinking. That kind of thinking is triggered. It's I quit.
so you get that
So, like for example, it's too late for me to go to school and get an education. That's quitting. Because that's not true. Because there's no age limit on getting an education, and if you get an education at 90 years old, it doesn't mean, well, it's too late because I can't work. because now you're just you're defining things. It's like you may not get hired at McDonald's at 90 years old. You may not get hired as a CEO when you're 90 years old and you just got your first college degree. You're so but those are reality issues. They're not limitation issues. They're just reality issues. But that doesn't mean that you can't go get an education, learn how to do something, and then invent something amazing. That's not out of the picture. My dad's 83, and he makes these clocks that are amazing, and he designs them. He designs them, and he uh, uh, draws out, on CAD programs. He'll draw out and then send the components that he needs to have made to a guy. I guess the guy's in Minnesota, I think he said, and the guy cuts these pieces for him. He doesn't know what they are. He just does what my dad tells him to do, and then sends them back. And then my dad assembles these clocks that are very intricate, very intricate mechanisms. 83 years old. I mean, it's not there's no such thing as it's too late, to be able to do something. And my dad, he only started doing that. Gosh, I can't even remember, 5 or 10 years ago, maybe. It's not like he was a clockmaker since he was in his 20s, and he's still doing it. He's always been a mechanical design engineer. But and so it's obviously a developed skill. But making clocks, learning how clocks work, learning the science behind making clocks, those kinds of things, the physics. He had to go learn all that. But he had to learn that later on in life. He didn't know that from before. He had to go look it all up. He had to learn, these things. And so my point being, though, is that just simply that idea of somebody saying, oh well, this happened, and so I can't therefore forever. It's quitting when it comes right down to it. And I don't mean that in some kind of mean way,
Right.
you're a quitter. But the idea is you have to understand that you're quitting it. And I think that happens more often than the idea of this situation being the end. I do honestly believe that people know that there is something beyond whatever that is.
Mhm.
They just wanted it to be this other thing. And they can see that this other thing is probably not going to happen in the way they wanted it to happen, as quickly as they wanted it to happen. So it's the parameters behind all of it. It's more that kind of a thing of, I wanted this to happen, I wanted it to happen a certain way in a certain period of time. And usually that's where they're at, and they say, oh, forget it, because it's not going to happen that way and in that time. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen, or that something can happen, that can replace that.
Okay, so you're talking about if I could give it my own term, like a mental flexibility that we actually touched a little bit on last week, but that the way you're talking about it now is way more specific, because you mentioned, I put this down to ask about, but you said they're defining parameters.
Yeah.
And so that's a very interesting and insightful statement about human nature. We do that a lot. We
Yeah.
define parameters often.
Yeah.
And so, you said they just wanted it to be this or the other thing, and it didn't
Right.
work out that way, so now it's done.
Yeah.
And so, how do you unlock the brain to stop thinking like that?
Well, that's the issue is understanding that your choices matter. And so I when I was younger, it's funny because this is all backwards. When I was younger, being cynical was fun, because I could use that, and with dark humor, and cut people, deeply. Sometimes so deeply that only intelligent people would laugh, because they wouldn't actually get what I said. And that was fun. It was fun. Yeah, I know you say, oh, that was cruel and stuff like that. I'm talking backwards, and at 20 years old, it was a fun thing to do, when you're a thinker and you're analytical, and and you're not really caught up in becoming rich and famous, which is where I was at the time. But as I've gotten older, it's the fun has gone out of it, because it's more fun, it's more enjoyable, I should say, to be positive than to be cynical. And because the potential, because your brain will latch on to whatever you're thinking about. And so, this is the whole idea. It's funny because Jesus talks about he was is a slave to sin. And so the idea is you can't mess with sin without sin taking control of your life. And we see that at a mental level, is that when you mess with things at a mental level, that's why we find ourselves becoming, addicted to things, good and bad. Is whatever we give our mind to is what our mind locks onto, and becomes you're digging grooves that become very familiar and easy. They're easy to maneuver. They're like big multi-lane highways, as opposed to meandering through some, I know my wife, she can't stand driving in narrow mountain roads. That just doesn't like that at all. But big white highways, no problem. But the truth is when you're on one of those kind of roads, you're a lot more people get killed on the freeway than they do on those roads. I mean, you might hear one or two people going off the edge, but very rarely compared to the number of people that get banged up on a freeway. But because you have to be more careful, right? But when your mind locks onto a way of thinking, it just becomes easier. And so I found that, as I started to get older, not super old, but as I started to get older, hitting probably my 40s, I really started to stop being so cynical. But because I had a reputation, nobody ever noticed it. And even now into my 50s and 60s, because I was like that and got such a dark reputation, that way some people, that's all they know about me. And it's like I'm just not even like that anymore. I'll have my moments, where I will say something sarcastic or cynical.
Especially if you're on the family thread, it will happen.
Well, apparently, which actually, it's funny because I felt a bit guilty, and I've held back a lot on that thread, because it's like, no, I'm going to hurt somebody if I jump into this, because I will go till I win, so because I've learned how to do all that from my past, and I'm trying to stay in this positive frame of mind. It's like I said, it's a much more enjoyable place to be. Other people like it as well. I noticed that.
No comment.
I noticed that. I noticed that other people like when people are nice to them. So me, I kind of like getting a kicking every now and then, but not incessantly. I don't think anybody does. But being positive, and staying positive is I think the important thing of unlocking.
Your wife mentioned this. She said Dave's becoming positive and encouraging, like Caleb.
Well, I'm trying to be positive and encouraging because because it's easier to think the way that I'm trying to encourage people to think. It's easier to do that when you're like that, because it teaches them to be that way. But because I've worked at this for so long. I mean, I really have, for years of my life. I've been my own subject, for years, my own guinea pig for years of just, how do I wrench myself out of mentalities and ways of thinking, and how do you embrace, learning to embrace difficulty, learning how to embrace trials, of life, learning how to do that, and so it's something I've been doing for a long time, and I'd say probably almost since I began pastoring, because I hadn't realized how difficult it would be to be a pastor. I thought being a pastor, I mean, it really is. I would say of all the jobs that I've had, and on all the jobs that I've worked, from entry-level jobs up to professional jobs, this is the hardest job I've ever had, because nobody thinks pastors do anything. That's the big question. What do you do with all your free time? And it's like, think about killing myself. That's what I do mostly. Wishing that life was over so I don't have to listen to people like that ever again. Tell me how my life is a waste of space. you know. But the but the so being positive and encouraging has its
Not
benefits.
everybody thinks that. Just
No,
saying.
no, no. I know not everybody thinks that way, but you know, it's funny. It's the people that you, the people that, some of the people that you help don't think that way.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
That's as far as I'll go.
And
That's as
observing
far.
that, and observing
That's
that
as
is how I know
far.
it's not like that.
That's as far as I'll go, because
Yeah.
it's not everybody that you help that comes back
Yeah,
and
yeah,
says
yeah.
thanks. Sometimes
Yeah,
they come back and say, "You jerk." You know, look at
yeah,
what you've
yeah,
done.
yeah,
Now
yeah.
now my life is going somewhere in life, and now all the fun's gone. I have to work for a living. It's like,
Oh man. So yeah, no, because I want to drive. So drive this a little further, because there's now, like I said, this is this whole idea of getting stuck in a mindset. I remember distinctly actually, the first time I ever took shrooms was like a moderate
yeah,
trip, and then
I would say that helps, honestly.
so interesting.
I don't recommend it for the Christian, but you know,
That's actually there's a clinical, you can actually get that
yeah,
medically prescribed now.
yeah.
Apparently, I don't know if that's a state by state thing.
Yeah,
Or if
I
it's
would
just
certainly
nationwide,
not.
but
I don't. I haven't done mushrooms in 42 years, and have no intentions of
so
doing it. But I must say that having done mushrooms in the past, having done psychedelic drugs, it does. You know, because the whole idea of expanding your mind, it does, in a sense, expand your mind from the standpoint of you stop thinking about life, you know, in your narrow little track.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It is interesting what happens in the brain with the whole thing.
Yeah,
Now, I've done drugs that hit the body, but that was new for me, because I'd never taken something before that, other than, like, weed and pills and,
yeah,
things that
yeah,
they did stuff to your body. But
yeah.
this was
Well,
the
they do
first time
obviously do stuff to your mind, but
right, no, but
not
it's all a
good.
feeling thing. It didn't
Yeah.
make me think
Yes. Yes.
anything.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
the mental state of mind was way different
Yeah.
when we did this. And so the first time I took, like, a very moderate experience, but the second time we did it, we didn't know this until after we took them, but apparently they were doused in acid,
Mm.
which is like mushrooms on steroids.
Right.
And so we took this, and we were at our house, and I'm seeing things. I'm literally tripping. But I started going down a trail in my mind where
Yeah.
all of a sudden everything was bad.
Yeah.
Like and so somebody told me, you're having a bad trip,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what it means
Yeah.
to trip at the time.
Yeah.
And so I'm totally foreign. This is all foreign to me. And all of a sudden it just clicked. Like, at first, when they first said that, it took me even further down this
Yeah.
hole.
Yeah.
And then they said something, or, well, what they said kept playing through my head. You're going, it's a bad trip. This is a bad trip. And all of a sudden something clicked, and I said, I'm just tripping. It's okay. I'm tripping. This is going to
Yeah.
pass.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all the bad feelings, and at the time
Yeah.
I called it the bad vibe, just
Right.
went away.
Yeah.
And I was just in this state of, like, sharpness, and my mind was, like, thinking, and a buddy of mine was starting to go on a bad trip.
Mm-hmm.
And so I told him, dude, it's okay, man. Everything's okay. Everything's going to be okay. And he was like, you know what? You're right. And it was like we both came to
Maybe
this
that's it.
click
Maybe
of
I
it.
should be serving mushrooms to the people I'm trying to help.
So we went through this, got it, anyway. My point is, in sharing all that, is this was when I was not, even thinking about trying to be an intelligent person at all, but looking back on situations like that, it is interesting how you can make a decision and just switch the way you're thinking.
Yeah.
And I've only recently started experiencing that outside of drugs,
Yeah.
being able to control
Well, that's
my thinking.
that's what I'm talking about for 42 years. Well, not quite 42 years, but for quite a good majority of that period of time, probably 30 of those at least. It just from the standpoint of, because controlling your mind is not half the battle. Controlling your mind is the majority of the battle in life, because you can't think your way. How do I want to say this? Because it's not exactly what I want to say. You can't think your way out of reality. You have to accept reality. But you can think yourself deeper into reality. Because often we're at a place to where we're somewhere between reality and fantasy. And so what is real, you can't overcome that in your thinking. but what isn't real you can. And so that's why it's so important to being hopeful, of your circumstances is so critical, because when you decide, I'm going to have hope. And this is the thing that makes Christianity, because Christianity is not a blind faith or a false hope. It is actually a real hope and a very seeing faith. Because you can see the results of your faith, and the non-Christian can't understand that idea, because there's fate and there's faith. Fate, is the idea that things can work out a certain way, and things will work out a certain way, and it's just fate, just things happen, but faith it's not that. It's faith is something that you can believe for a good outcome for a thing, which can trigger you to look for the good outcome. What will that look like? You'll be looking for that. And it will also help you to put your trust in the God who can make all things work together for good. And so that's the Bible doesn't specifically say. The Bible says all things work together for good to them who are the called, who love God, and are the called according to His purpose. And so there are. It's not just a blanket statement. All things work together for good, because that's not true. But all things do work together for good to those who love God and to those who are following His purpose. And so when you're following God's purpose, everything literally does work out to good, because the purpose is not you being better. The purpose is God's purpose being fulfilled. And you can take this thinking too far, but the bottom line is that no matter what happens to you in life, that idea, I don't totally agree with it, but whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's a truth to that. Is the idea is the things you survive in life, the difficult things that you survive in life, they do make you stronger. And only by dying in the process is that over, that terminates, that die literally.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
And so, but let's, that can only happen once. Only one time can something kill you. So, but a lot of things will not kill you, and those things, all of those things have the potential to make you stronger. All of those things, but it depends on how your mind is set. If your mind is set to God's eternal purposes, because the eternal purpose is why the world exists. And so you have to understand from that perspective that the world exists for God's pleasure and purpose. And we are in that. We are all a part of this thing that God has built for His pleasure and purpose. And so when we align ourselves with His pleasure and purpose, then all things will work together, because they have they have to. It's not a question of choice. It's that they have to, because God makes it like that. He makes it like that because everything is forced to live according to His purposes. Now, when it comes to our individual choices, that doesn't remove the reality of choice, and that doesn't leave us room. I was just having a conversation earlier this afternoon with somebody, is that every decision and every choice we make is not, it's not going to be the will of God. It's not going to just be, I've done it, I'm locked in, and then when you don't do the will of God, that was a terrible choice, and that's it, and I'm done for, because, that wasn't the will of God, and so I've just wrecked the whole thing. It's not like that. The way God created life is there's room. There's space. And that's why I tell people, stop thinking binary about life, because life isn't binary. There's all kinds of different ways that things can play out in between those two extremes. You want to stay away from the extremes, but there's so many different roads and ways and things that happen in between there, that everything doesn't just have one road ultimately. Everything doesn't just lead to one road at some point. It's not like that. It's not how life works. It's just that there are roads that lead to roads. and then other roads that lead to other roads, and those roads might lead to something, more narrow, but more than likely it doesn't. There's a lot of I keep wanting to say wiggle room. There's a lot of wiggle room in between that things are not just, nothing in life is based on one singular decision, and even if you made a bad decision that triggers a series of consequences, that doesn't have to stay there. There can be other decisions that you make that can put you back on the path. You may lose time, you may lose intensity is not really the word I'm looking for. Reward, maybe, but it's not a loss.
So it's interesting you mentioned that scripture of all things work together for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. That
but the important point is it doesn't say God does that. It
Right.
just says that's how it happens.
Yeah.
So it's in our lap. It's in our lap to experience.
Uh-huh.
With whether we want to or not
Yeah.
is now up to us. It's not whether or not God wants to. It's in our lap to experience.
So obviously there is, though, because like looking back at the scripture I mentioned in Deuteronomy, because the tail end of this, he says, I call heaven and earth as a witness against you. I set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that you and your descendants may live. And then he goes on to say, and that you may love the Lord, your God, obey him, hold fast to him, for he is your life and he will prolong your life in the land.
Yeah.
And so this is a promise he's making to Israel, but obviously has a much broader application.
Yeah.
And so thinking about it in connecting those two ideas together, because of the scripture you mentioned, now, talking about the idea of loving God. Now, how does a person make choices that revolve around or demonstrate a love for God to where this becomes their experience? Or I should say it affects their experience
Yeah.
in a positive way.
Yeah. Well, God has to be external, not internal. And this is I've finally landed on something that'll help me to explain this. People, religious people, create their own God. And it's a God based on their own concepts and their own interpretation of things. So it's a construct. It's an internal construct. But God is not an internal construct. God is an external being. And what you think you know about God, if it comes from your own internal musings, it isn't. I can assure you, you are wrong, because that is not how we determine external beings. It's an example that I use often when I talk to people who want to try to play that game with me and want to tell me how God is, in their personal thinking. I will bring out this imaginary person and say, maybe you were married, or I actually, if I can find a real person in their life, are you married? I'll say, and they say, yeah. And I say, okay, so you're married, and so what's your wife's name? And they'll tell me their wife's name. And say, well, actually, I think that her name's Mary. And so when I see her, I'm going to call her Mary. And you guys will probably be okay with that. And the kind of confused look on their face. And so what does she do for a living? Oh, she's a nurse. Well, I think she's an engineer. And so Mary, the engineer that you're married to, and then I build this composite out of things that I think, and then I say, so when I meet your wife and I tell her, oh, I was just talking to your husband and I know all about you. Your name's Mary, or you're an engineer, and I go through all these. She's going to look at me and she's going to go, yeah. And well, of course not. Of course not. Because that's just me internalizing, my concept of your wife. It's not your wife. It has nothing to do with your wife. It has to do with my concepts. And that's what people do with God, is you have concepts of God. You have a construct that you've made of who God is, but it's not who God is. Just because you think that's who God is doesn't make him God any more than just because I think your wife should be an engineer and her name should be Mary, that's your wife. It's the same thing, because God is not a concept.
Mhm.
God is a being.
And so how do you make your choices match that? Like what is
Well,
the
you have to
outflow of
get to
that?
know the being, and loving him is like anything. When we choose to love, uh, even Jesus says, love your enemies. Well, how do you love your enemies? Well, you overlook their shortcomings. You overlook the things you don't like about them. You overlook all of these things. You let them be them, and you love them uh, for who they are, not for what you want them to be,
Hmm.
and you work through that, and so that's, you have to do that when it comes to God. Is your love of God is not, you know, uh, giving him attributes. He's not Barbie, that you dress him up any way that you feel like.
Hmm.
He is a being.
So kind of a last question here is that are there situations that we just, or I should say, are there areas in life where we just don't have a choice? What I mean, is it easy to quantify that?
Well, this is what I really didn't talk about it in the beginning, but this was what was going on in my mind in the beginning. Is really what it comes down to is the reason why people call choice of illusion has to do with the frame that you're putting that in, the perspective that you're speaking from, the context of it, because you ask the question, is there such thing as where you really don't have a choice? No, you always have a choice in a matter, but you may not have an option to make a choice about. But you always have a choice, like, with my kids, when they're younger, either clean your room or go to bed. Well, I want to play. That's not one of your options.
Right.
You still have a choice, but that's not one of the options. And so that's true of everybody, is that we always have a choice in a matter, but the thing that we would like to choose isn't always an option. And so you have to choose from the options, but you always have a choice.
Very interesting. That that is actually a very good last line. I remember. I think I'll just end with this story. I remember my wife had told me quite a bit about some of the conversations you had with her when I was losing my mind, and this is actually before I even went into the rehab. Clarissa had no idea how things were going to end
Yeah.
up. It didn't even look like there was any light at the end of the tunnel for a while. But she mentioned that you had talked to her about playing the hand you've been dealt,
Yeah.
and that this is
Yeah.
this is how things are.
Yeah.
And I remember her telling me specifically that my dad told me, you might, talking about me,
Yeah.
he might go off the rails and just be
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah.
This could be the direction he goes.
Yeah.
But the only thing you can do now is, what are you going to do if that happens?
Yeah.
And now here's the direction life is going. You
Yeah.
have this, it's potential in this direction, potential in this direction, but you have to choose from those two of how you're going to respond to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so even when, essentially it seems like her life is just being blown up, she still has a choice to make.
Yeah.
And so it's very
Absolutely.
interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you never come to a place where you literally have no choice. There's no such thing as having no choice. You may not have the option that you want, and so because you can't have that option, you don't want to even consider the other options,
Yeah.
because that's what you wanted. And so it's between having that or not having that. So I don't
Yeah.
have any choice.
And
I have
back
to
to that
live
whole
without it.
setting
Yeah.
parameters thing
I have
you were
to,
talking
yeah,
about.
I have to live without it.
Yeah.
It's too late. It's over. It's finished. It's like, no, there are other options. There are other things to choose from. They may not be what you wanted, but that doesn't mean that there's not a choice. Like in that situation, because, I see, I play these scenarios out, in my mind. When I think about these kinds of things, and I think about the kinds of things people are going to do, or things that happen to people, you know, if you play them out, they can play out any kind of way. There's no such thing as playing out a certain way. If you take off, you blow yourself to smithereens, and you're done, and then you just have these kids, and it's just you and these kids. Well, you have a good family, You have a mother and father who love you. They're not going to just kick you to the curb. And worst came to worst, she could move in with us until she can, work things out. And my wife loves babysitting, and so there's resources there. And it isn't a question of whether other people have these resources. This is the choices that are available. So even if she didn't have that, then it would be another set of choices, and it'd be like, okay, I have to do it this way then. I have to do it some other way. It's not. It's over. It's finished. It's never that kind of thing. Even if she didn't have a loving family, and that was around, maybe for whatever reason she was an only child, and her parents were dead. That doesn't mean that there are not choices. Options, difficult ones. She could still work. And she wouldn't be able to just stay home and be a stay-at-home mom, which is what she wanted to be. But it's not. Okay, well, you're not going to be a stay-at-home mom. Okay, that's not an option anymore. But what do you have an option? You have an option for an employment that you can try to get, like what she's working on now. The idea of the being a school nurse, and the opportunity, certain days to be able to see your kids, when you work at that school, or get a job at your kids' school. Oh, well, my kids are all two, 3, and 4, Okay, well, different choices, different scenario, different situation. What can you do? How can you make that work? What are the choices available to you? And they may not be the ideal choices. They may not even be good choices, but they are still choices at this juncture that you can make and move forward.
Yeah.
And then once you move forward, you are going to now be presented with more choices and more choices and more choices. And the truth of the matter is, at that time, you guys were what, 20-somethings?
Barely. I think she was 31. I was 30.
30. Okay, so 30s, but still, young enough that if you decided this is it, I'm done, I'm going to ruin my life forever, that she couldn't, keep herself together and work and be somebody who is still able to attract, a husband. It isn't like, that could never happen. And the truth is that when it comes to the will of God for her life as a pastor's wife, that's not out the door. There's still a possibility even in that situation. But my point in all that is there are still possibilities of things. And that's the thing that I think is so difficult for people to see is they don't get what they want, and they stop exercising the ability to choose because they didn't get what they want. Yeah. And that's just being childish. Yeah. Because what you will end up with, I was driving along today and I saw a guy holding a sign. He was obviously, begging for money, and I looked at it, I thought, and looking at this guy's obviously something recently happened. He wasn't, he didn't have a big long beard. He was well shaven and well dressed. I mean, he didn't look like he was wearing clothes that had been given to him or anything like that. And so this is obviously I lost my job. I need to do something. What am I going to do? Well, until I get a job, I'm going to do this. And it's like, no, that's not what you need to do. Because that may be a way of you collecting money, not paying taxes, and getting more money than you could working a job, that is a lower paying job, but you lose your dignity in the process. It ends up you're going to end up in a situation to where no matter how much money you make, you're not going to be able to afford to live. Yeah. It's a guarantee that you're not going to be able to afford to living this way unless you become a con artist, yeah. and that take it to the extreme where you're pretending to be homeless and you're not. But you're better off to take a job, and it's funny because people, I can't get a job. And I think the number of signs that I see all over the place, we're hiring,
yeah.
We're hiring. And it's like, it's not that there are not jobs. You just don't want that job.
Yeah.
You don't want to take that job because it's you're above that. You got your pride. Okay, well, fine. Let your pride, see how your pride likes it when you're homeless, when you haven't got anything, but there are things you can do. You always have choices. You always have choices. Yeah. So.
Very cool. All right. We'll end on that note. We appreciate you guys joining, and as always, we do invite folks to come be a part of our service in person. Wednesday night service. We have a Sunday morning, Sunday evening church service. It's here at the building that we're in now in San Carlos. And so if you're in the area, come and join us. We'd love to meet you. And we will be here again next week. So look out for that. I will have the topic on time and thumbnail on time. So we look forward to being here again next week. Thanks for joining, and have a good night.